Hey, what's up? It's Ms. D. I'm picking up where we left off in our discussion of ancient Egypt. This is part two. And in our last video, we kind of ended off with the discussion of the government of ancient Egypt, that it enabled and kind of organized the workforce to enable the development of different public works, such as development of the irrigation systems, as well as laws to kind of benefit society. We're all going to develop, speaking of Egyptian society, this is a picture of the social hierarchy that existed in ancient Egypt. At the top, you have a pharaoh. Pharaoh is a king. He is a god made man. And the pharaoh would inherit his position from his dad, who more likely than not was married to his sister, which is all kinds of yucky, but that's how they rolled. There was a certain level of social mobility. Now, it is very limited, but what do I mean by that? What happens is if you were, let's say, take a farmer, for example, and you were able to save enough money and, have enough wealth to get your child an education, your child, if they're able to learn to write, and read and write, they would be able to be a scribe, and so they could move up the social hierarchy and have better status and what have you. So that was an option available in ancient Egypt. Most civilizations are pretty strict, and they're not they don't allow that level of mobility. Another difference between ancient Egypt and a lot of the other civilizations we're going to take a look at is its approach to women. As you can see, women had many more rights in ancient Egypt than they had in other societies. But again, I don't want to oversell it. Women were by no means equal. They were still subservient, second-class citizens in comparison to men. Even somebody like Nefertiti, who obviously is one of the great famous queens of ancient Egypt, even she, historians still debate whether or not, how powerful she was. But even if, as they say that she ruled in her own right, even she, as powerful as she had herself portrayed as a man. This is one of the last images they have of her portrayed as female. When you see later images of her, she's always wearing a beard. She references herself as a man. She has herself pictured as male, and so on. Nonetheless, she was able to have some level of authority. But what was much more common for women in ancient Egypt was that they ruled as a regent. So what that means is if the pharaoh died and had a young son, and the mother could often rule in the child's name until the child reached adulthood. Once the child became an adult, the mother would, of course, step aside, and then the child would rule in his own name. All right, so ancient Egypt was considered pretty advanced in the fields of science and mathematics and what have you. Medicine, obviously, if you're going to pull somebody's organs out to prepare them for mummification, you do learn a bit about anatomy and so on. So supposedly the medicine for its day was pretty advanced. I talked earlier about the development of a calendar to allow the ancient Egyptians to know that the floods were annual. And obviously, if you know the floods happen twice a year, you have to know how long a year is. So they did develop a calendar, which had 365 days, 12 months. Obviously, no leap year. So that's what threw it off and made it inaccurate. The writing system, as you know from the bottom right, those are hieroglyphics. The reason we can read it is because of that black Rosetta Stone, the photo of it right there. Supposedly there was a message written in ancient Egyptian, as well as I believe ancient Greek and some other language, I can't recall. But what have you, but because the historians, the linguists could read ancient Greek, that allowed them to translate the message, the message that was written in Egyptian, and break the kind of code of how ancient Egyptian works. And that's why we can read hieroglyphics today. And obviously the art and architecture of ancient Egypt is famous. I mean, the Great Pyramids, the Sphinx, and, temples and what have you. Also, be aware that ancient Egypt was an important part of the trade networks of the ancient world. Ancient Egypt had a lot of contact with Mesopotamia. There was a lot of trade there. They also traded with that eastern coast of Africa, as well as throughout the Mediterranean Sea. So later, the Egyptian society lasts for a really long time. They are going to be trading with ancient Greece, the people of the Italian Peninsula, and so on and so forth throughout that Mediterranean region. So that's going to allow for more contact and sharing of ideas and so on. Another aspect of Egypt that makes it a little different than a lot of the other societies, it's something important to keep in mind, is that Egypt is protected by natural barriers. You may remember I spoke earlier about the fact that Egypt was not subject to the constant warfare like we see in Mesopotamia. Part of the reason for that is because of the cataracts that we see right there within the Nile River. So if you take a look, you see there's those red dashes. Those cataracts, basically those are areas where either, you have rapids, you'll have a waterfall, but what have you. So the people of, let's say, Kush or Nubia could not get in their boats and then travel up the Nile River to attack ancient Egypt. The cataracts blocked them from being able to do that. In addition, if you look by the Mediterranean Sea, you can see how that Nile River, the end of it is almost like a broom, right? That it kind of spreads out. That basin area, the delta area right there, very marshy. So it's like, it's like very muddy and mucky and, like swampy. So it's very hard. You're not going to be able to march an army through that area to kind of attack ancient Egypt. Now, that's not to say it's impossible to get to ancient Egypt. It will eventually be conquered and, absorbed into other empires. But for much of its history, it is left alone. It is able to develop, and it's not subject to the constant warfare like we see, for example, in Mesopotamia. All right, so before we finish up, I just want to draw your attention and remind you to always bear in mind as we're learning about civilizations to keep in mind the big 3 C's, change, continuity, and connection. So for example, at this stage, we have learned about the civilizations in Paleolithic times. We've learned about Mesopotamia. Now we're looking at ancient Egypt. So just in the back of your mind, you should be thinking, oh, wait a second. From Paleolithic times now into these civilizations, have things changed? Are there certain things that's the same? Are any of these civilizations connected? Are they influencing each other? And when it comes to change and continuity over time, are we seeing the same issues that affect Paleolithic man? Are they still impacting ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia? Are things staying the same? Or are there now new issues or new things that have changed, made a significant change from one period to the next? Or is there differences? What are the differences between ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia? In what ways are they same? Now, in addition to ancient worlds, sometimes also, if you really want to take it next level, don't forget you can also compare to today. So you might be thinking, well, what are you talking about? Ancient Egypt? Come on, please. Yeah, what does that have to do with today? Well, if you think about the ancient world, right? We've been talking about the importance of climate, the importance of being able to create food, right? And how climate affects people, about how the importance of irrigation. I mean, this is, in a lot of ways, this is a continuity. This is something that even today we have to be aware of. Like, take a look. This is a story from AP about climate change, that ranchers now have to consider irrigation, that they can't irrigate their land. Maybe they're going to have to move, or, if the land doesn't support the development of life, this is still an issue, even in our modern day. Or here's another one. Did you know that this idea about going to war over resources, that's something that continues into World War II? In fact, did you know that in World War II, part of the reason that is given for Hitler's plan to exterminate the Jews in World War II is actually connected to the idea that Germany felt it was absolutely critical for Germany to have food, that he needed to secure food for his troops. And this need for what he called Liebesraum, more land for the Germans, he was going to get that land by conquering territory and the people who lived on that land, working them to death and starving them. So this need for food, this need to go to war over resources is not new. It's going to continue even into the modern day and into other civilizations. All right. With that, you are done. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.